So, if you guys remember, a little over a week ago, I made a video about Novak Djokovic's comeback from 2 sets down against Jannik Sinner, and talked about how, Djokovic has kind of numbed me, and I know a lot of others, with these comebacks from a set or even 2 sets down, where through stretches of the opening portion of matches, he will look, very low energy and completely despondent, really. And then, like it's nothing, snap of a finger, and he's a completely different player and reels off a run of 3 straight sets where, even with a 2-set-to-love lead, you feel like you never really had a chance. So, throughout this video, I really just wanted to do some digging on the numbers behind Djokovic falling behind in recent years. Really just wanted to see whether those align with what, it appears with Novak more and more these days being prone to being a slow starter. Because thinking back on it over the stretch since Novak really emerged yet again, Djokovic 3.0 as I'm going to call it throughout this video, from Wimbledon 2018 and on, it has seemed like he has been more and more prone to having to overcome him not playing his best in stretches or even full matches. And, as a result, Djokovic throughout his career never really has been one to go through a full tournament with his best stuff sustained throughout. Usually he has to overcome a clunker here or there early in the tournament, even in those where at the end of the tournament he was at his razor sharp best. But even taking that into account, it certainly has seemed like those off days that Djokovic has had to overcome, or slow starts that he's had to overcome, have definitely accelerated at rate over these last couple of years. And in particular, I would say the last 2 years is where it has really grown very noticeable, with tournaments like the French Open in 2021, last year's US Open, where he was gunning for the calendar Grand Slam, saw him drop the first set in 5 of his 7 matches played there. This year, off the top of my head, I can remember Belgrade. I believe most of his matches there, he ended up dropping the first set and winning up until the final. And then, we just came off Grand Slam number 21, but through the last 3 rounds there, Novak Djokovic experienced these slow starts, dropping the first set in each one of them, of course rallying back in all 3 of them. And that really is what has been the most remarkable part, is that it seems like almost every single time he has rallied to come all the way back, even when experiencing these slow starts and putting himself behind the 8-ball per se. And throughout this video, I hope to provide the numbers to really back up if this is really true, and if it is, if there is a method to the madness. So without further ado, let us just hop into these numbers. So as far as this case was concerned, I took the records off of Grand Slam matches in which he has dropped the first set, mainly just because it's a more reliable sample size in my opinion, because Djokovic has very clearly made it a point that the majors have been his priority as he's aged and into his 30s, and in best of 3, there is a clear, easing off the gas pedal that you see in certain instances with Djokovic in best of 3 over the last couple of years. I think that stands to reason, and truthfully it makes my job a lot easier, because I really do wish that Tennis Stats had something along the lines of Basketball Reference and stuff like that, where you could filter out records particularly for certain situations, as well as particular periods in time in someone's career. But as far as I know, that is not the case, so I have gone by hand charting all these records myself. Obviously, human error is a possibility. I did my best to double check, make sure that as far as I was concerned, everything that I laid out was in line. Y'all are also free to check for yourself using the match logs on the activity tab on player profiles on the ATP site. That's what I did, and verify for yourself if you need it. But anyways, as far as the topic of this video is concerned, I took the sample for Djokovic 3.0, as I've labeled him, from Wimbledon 2018 all the way through the present day as far as his major appearances. And what I found really did fall in line with what I felt as far as, the first set trend really being a bigger thing come post-pandemic, really. And that makes a lot of sense to me, because I have felt that even in this post-prime of Novak Djokovic's, where he's experienced a great deal of success, particularly in 2021, personally, I do feel that the best of his post-prime years was that stretch from second half of 2018 all the way through the Australian Open in 2019. He played very clean tennis throughout that stretch, and in the latter two of those majors, he was dominant. So it really does stand to reason that you really didn't see that many first sets dropped. And certainly, I'm not indicating that, those first set drops is an indication of level not being all that high. That definitely isn't the case. I mean, you take the 2021 French Open, for example, where he dropped the first, I believe, 3 times along the way to winning the title, and I think that tournament is easily the best clay court tennis he has played in his 30s. But nonetheless, getting back on topic, we really have seen that become a trend, in particular following the initial pandemic break in 2020. In totality, for Djokovic 3.0, I had a record of 16-5, and when you zoom in even more on the stretch ever since the tour resumed in 2020, he is 15-3. That comes out to a winning percentage of 83% in that span, coming back from a set down. In other words, that basically means that every 6 matches that Djokovic has found himself dropping the opening set, he has won 5 out of each of those 6. And that in a vacuum is impressive enough. That is ridiculous. It's ridiculous to have a winning record from a set down in general, but for it to be that overwhelming is just absurd. And I said this in my video after Djokovic beat Sinner at Wimbledon this year, that, there's so many times where Djokovic or Nadal, just don't have it that day, but they never are going to give you an easy match. And the fact that so often in these majors, Novak has rallied to come back and really justifiably by these numbers now be considered a favorite against just about everybody from a set and even 2 sets down. And these numbers lay out exactly why that is the case. But I also was curious to if this trend has upped in frequency as much as it has seemed ever since that pandemic break. So I did the liberty of taking all the Grand Slam matches that Djokovic has played, both since 2018 Wimbledon as well as following the pandemic resumption, and determined just how frequently it's been happening in majors. And over the course of that since Wimbledon 2018 sample, he is at a 22% clip of matches in slams where he has dropped the opening set. That alone doesn't seem all that much. A little over 1 in 5, but it certainly isn't as jarring as the number when you take it from following pandemic resumption to present day. And in that case, we get a number of roughly 35%. So that basically means that Novak Djokovic, ever since the tour resumed in 2020, has been dropping the opening set in his Grand Slam matches at a frequency a little over 1 in every 3 matches he plays at a slam. And considering typically you have to win 7 matches to win a Grand Slam, just think about how wild that is and how often he's finding himself in these situations. And I have sat there during several of his matches over this stretch. For example, the second set of the 2021 French Open final, where I'm like, how can you just so nonchalantly pretty much mail in a set like that? one that you would think is so important. And so often the first set is exactly that. It's such a tone setter, but as these numbers bear out, Novak Djokovic has come through just about every single time. So anyways, I was curious as to how these stats would shake up when compared to the stretch that I consider to be his prime. So I took the same criteria and looked through each of his slam matches from 2011 to the first half of 2016, essentially taking that up to the conclusion of that year's French Open. And what I found was, similarly, Djokovic here had 21 such matches where he dropped the opening set with a record of 13-8. Now, as you can tell on the surface, the sample of his prime is a longer span than even taking Wimbledon 2018 to present day. In addition to that, you have to take into account that Djokovic from Wimbledon 2018 to present day also lost early, not being 100% at the 2019 US Open. Of course, was defaulted earlier than would have been expected at the US Open in 2020, and most recently was not allowed to play this year's Australian Open. So with an already fewer amount of Grand Slam matches there, that obviously meant that he was going down a set with much less regularity back in what would be considered to be his prime years. But my question was, by how much? And so I found that over the course of 148 total Grand Slam matches from 2011 to the first half of 2016, Novak Djokovic in that span was dropping the opener in roughly 14% of his Grand Slam matches. So as I said before, the same amount of matches where he dropped the opening set as in slams since Wimbledon 2018. However, 50 additional matches played in slams in his prime span. And that gives us an uptick of about 8%, as he was around roughly 22% in that since Wimbledon 2018 span. The most stark contrast, however, is when you look at his prime compared to the post-pandemic break 2020 span, where you see that his frequency in dropping the opening set in majors has more than doubled. I mean, you're looking at 14 versus 35% there. And that gulf that exists between those two numbers I found to be very jarring. And before I do some big picture takeaways, I did one last bit of number crunching for this exercise, which was taking all of Novak's matches from post-pandemic 2020 all the way to present day, and found that in the case of losing the first set, he remains 24-14 there. Obviously, that means that his win rate is not as great in best of three, and that obviously makes sense, because with it being best of three, you have a lot less wiggle room to come back from losing the first set. However, he still remains at a very respectable 9-11, and that stands well above his win rate outside of this particular span, which is about 40 matches under 500 outside of this span. This is opposed to the 10 matches over 500 that he is in this particular increment. And so that pretty much leads us to a conclusion that reads that Novak Djokovic undeniably, at least in Grand Slams, has become a much more frequent slow starter. And you would think that would be something along the lines of Dancing with the Devil, but more remarkably is his record has shown he's almost automatic in those cases. In fact, he blows pretty much any other span in his career out of the water in being able to rally from a set down. Now, how much can we really read into with this revelation? Well, I'll say this. I have heard some people say that Djokovic dropping sets left and right throughout certain tournaments over these last 2 years has shown some sign of decline. And again, I'll say that sets dropped really shouldn't be the best indicator for level of play. But what I will say is that definitively it is clear that Novak has more trouble now sustaining his best as well as maintaining it from match to match than when he did when he was younger, and, I would be shocked if that weren't the case. That is the natural way for things to go. He is 35 years old after all. So in that sense, obviously, it is not the same compared to what his prime was, but I will say on the other token, he is perhaps now harder to close out than he ever has before. Some of that I do feel is because the field throughout the 2010s, where I outlined the prime span of Djokovic's career, I do think that you wouldn't be able to get away with dropping the first set and being so lackadaisical at times as often as he has, but at the same time, these are no chumps, and to continually come back from a set down and almost always come out the winner is something that just cannot be undermined, and it kind of stands to reason given the way Djokovic has evolved into this post-prime phase of his career. In my opinion, he's not nearly the shot maker that he used to be. Obviously, in his prime, he still had that wall-up lockdown mode where he wouldn't miss, but he also was a lot more aggressive off the ground, in my opinion, back then. But with that, you did get some off days at times, albeit rare, but you did get them where he would, lose to Tommy Robredo in Cincinnati, or losing to Tommy Haas in Miami, and these are all smack dab in the middle of his prime, where he just threw in these random clunkers, mostly in best of three, but also the occasional loss to Nishikori at the US Open, one of the strangest of his career. And it doesn't really feel like you get those wild losses where he's just completely off the rails these days with Djokovic 3.0. I do feel like Novak these days really just beats you, suffocating you pretty much. There are, of course, those matches like the Aussie Open in 2019 in the final, where he showcases his shot-making ability on full display, but those feel like more exceptions than the norm. For the most part, it feels like Novak, at this point in his career, pretty much just squeezes errors out of you and forces you to be proactive with how there really is no place to attack. He has shored up just about every part of his game. It's what has led people to probably correctly call this version of him the most complete he's ever been, with the improved net play and a serve that just keeps getting better. It's very efficient, even with what I believe to be a diminished ability to create himself from the back of the court. If you're not Nadal, there's really no way that you're going to outsteady this guy from the baseline consistently, and he pretty much just doesn't give up cheap points unless you win outright with your serve. And that, in conjunction with his own improved serve as well as still best in the game return, there's a lot of points where he puts himself in advantageous positions for easier points himself just on those two alone. And I think that makes for a player where there's a lot less that can go wrong, especially against the field that he's up against now, than was the case even in his prime in the past. Albeit, I have made my position known that I think the prime is better all day, but, there is something to be said in how Djokovic 3.0 has made it just as hard as ever to beat him relative to this field, and pretty much harder than ever to close out. You may think you have him in trouble, but as recent history has taught us, all he's doing is prepping to take your legs.
He says Novak first takes out your legs, then he takes out your soul.
Thanks, Andy. I take that as a compliment. Only the first part. The second part, I don't take anybody's soul. But I'll take your legs out, that's for sure.